This year should be a blessing and a merit for the health and success of the families of Regina Bas Yosef Ruvain and Yeshaya ben Yisrael, Benjamin Wolf ben Tzvi Hersh, Baruch ben Benjamin Wolf, Shmuel Ruvain ben Regina. He should have a refuah shlema. It should also go for refuah shlema for Esther Libo Bas Chaya Yafa and Shlomo Leib ben Fega. And the shir should go for a bracha and hatzlacha and mazel for all these people. Thank you.
There is a certain idea which I'd like to share with everybody to answer the question, why doesn't the Geulah happen? Why doesn't redemption happen? So we know that one of the reasons why is because of what's called Lashon Hara, because people denigrate other people, other Jews. A Jew denigrates another Jew. And there's a tremendous amount of Lashon Hara spoken unfortunately, among the Jewish people. And that prevents the redemption. But one of the ideas which is difficult to understand is, look, the redemption is not simple. The redemption is a tremendous event. And how could something prevent such a significant idea of redemption? Because we speak Lashon Hara, why should that prevent the redemption? The Jewish people need it so much. So why should the fact that there's a lot of Lashon Hara, which is, of course, a bad sin, but it's a social sin. It's where you can harm somebody through your speech. It is the communicative ability to harm people using the power of speech. But that actually can prevent the Jewish people from being redeemed. Apparently, yes. That's what the Chofetz Chaim says. But why should that happen? That is the question. What is the power of speaking Lashon Hara to actually prevent such a necessary item as being redeemed from evil or being redeemed from exile? That's the interesting question. Now, there's a great deal to say, and so I'd like to comment on something which I think most people are unaware of. What is that? That din, which is justice, means that all things that happen has to happen in response to something. That's the concept of justice. Din, judgment. In other words, if A happens, right? If A is an event and it happens by people, then B must transpire. You see, that concept where all actions are judged or determined by our event itself, what we do, we actually cause spiritual repercussions, you see. Now, God decided a long time ago that He would be to us in one of two ways. God is a creator. There's no question about that, you see. But even as a creator, He could exhibit two roles, you see. He could exhibit two aspects or characteristics toward us. One aspect would be Avinu, a father, right? He would act to us as a father, which means that he would be good to us. He would benefit us completely, you see. So therefore, he's our father. So he would love us unconditionally. A second way that he can act toward us is not as a father, but as a king. And therefore the relationship between us and him would be, we are his subjects and he is our king. But then a king's relationship with his subjects is very different of the relationship between a father and a son. A father will always forgive his son. Of course, he may be aggrieved and frustrated, but he loves his son. That's what dominates the relationship. So he will always forgive his son, you see. So even if the son does something against the father, against his wishes and so on, the father, because he's the father, will always forgive his son. That is the nature of the relationship between the father and the son. But a king and his subject is different. If the subjects of the king listen to the king, respect the laws that the king promulgated, you see, does what the king asks, then the king will be loyal to his subjects and the relationship will be very good. But what happens if the subject disobeys the king? Then the king changes. He will act toward the subject, right, with the repercussion where he will punish the subject, you see, because the subject disobeys the king. So the relationship is based on obedience. That's the nature of the relationship. Obedience. You listen to me, I'm good to you. If, however, you do not listen to me, you disobey me, then I will punish you. That's obviously the repercussions. You see? So it all depends who God is acting as, what his role is. Is it a father to a child, a son? Or it's a king toward a subject. God, of course, is always both. But there are different times when he's more one, he's more Avinu, father, than Malkeinu, than a king, you see. And then there are times when he's more Malkeinu, he's more a king, and therefore the way he relates to us is different. We, of course, want God to be Avinu, and then Malkeinu, obviously, because God will always be forgiving to us no matter what we do, no matter how bad our disobedience is. That's interesting. We actually determine how God relates to us, either as Avinu Malkeinu, either as Avinu, which is our Father, or Malkeinu. Now, of course, he's always both, basically, but it depends. Different times, he leans more toward one characteristic or role than the other. And we determine what is he today. Is he Avinu or is he Malkeinu? But here's the problem. We determine what his role is. And we want him to be obviously Avinu. We want him to be our Father. Much more than Malkeinu, because then he will always forgive us, no matter what we do, because that's what a father does, right? So that's what we want him to be, Avinu. But then the problem is, you want him to be Avinu, then you have to act as a family, right? In other words, if the Jews are a family, then God is a father, you see. But if the Jews are not a family, then we are subjects. And if we are subjects, then he achieves an active role as Malkeinu, as our king. This is a very important secret of what in any given day, what his primary role is. We determine it, which is really in many ways a tremendous secret. Now, if we badmouth each other, talk Lashon Hara about each other, right? Speak Lashon Hara, which is tremendous, harmful communication, that we are obviously, right, not a family, because we are bad-mouthing each other. Families generally don't do that. So God says, if you're speaking against each other, then there's no family unity. There's no achdus. There's no family love. So then what are you? Well, then what you are to me is basically, right, not a family, right? You are a nation, right? Not a family. You're a subjects, kingdom. Then I will be a king, much more than a father. And if I'm a king, the key behavior of a king, right, since I am a king, is obedience. You have to be loyal, obedient subjects. And therefore bad news, because he looks then at our behavior toward, right, him. He looks at the behavior of the Jewish people toward each other. Are they brothers and sisters? Or are they basically not brothers and sisters, but they are nation, you see, without the family unity? And if that's the case, I will look toward you as subjects, much more than mishpacha, much more than family. You see, now here's the problem. The problem is God looks at us much more as a subject than as a family. So when we speak Lashon Hara all the time, we create the relationship that we have toward each other as subjects, but not as family. If we are not family, then what are we? Like I say, subjects. But then if that's the case, our relationship with God, right, is as subjects and not as family. So he's not really Avinu. We have made God into not Avinu. We have made him into Malkeinu. That's not good. That is why we are in Geulah for thousands of years. You see. But if we love each other, if we are concerned about each other, you see, if we try to take care of each other, do chesed, and not speak Lashon Hara, but we have tremendous obviously Israel, love of a Jew, and realize that every Jew is family. When Jews speak lashon hara about each other, what they do is they destroy the actus of a family. You see, that will guarantee that God will be Avinu. But if he's Avinu, then he will overlook the sins because he is now, in an active way, our Father. You see, we change the relationship that God has taught us from Malkeinu to Avinu primarily, and he will allow us to be redeemed because he loves us and he doesn't look the same way toward our sins, and therefore they do not, suspend his love for us. This is what happens. If you ask me and say, well, wait a minute, when did this ever happen? So there's a very interesting Chassam Sefer where you see it happened. When? By Yetzias Mitzrayim, by the exodus from Egypt. It says, by the exodus from Egypt, right? And when God is speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu, V'gam es hagoy, and when he says, V'gam shemati, I have also, in Parshas Vayera, I have also heard the cries of Israel, and therefore I'm redeeming them. So the Chassam Sefer says, what do you mean? What is the expression, I have also heard? It should just say, and God says, I have heard the cries of the Jews, right, in them being slaves, and therefore I have decided to redeem them. So that's what it should say, and I have heard the cries of the Jews. But it doesn't. It says, and I have also heard. Take a look, V'gam. I have heard their cries. So who does the also refer to? Who else is God listening to that the Jews should be redeemed? So the Chassam Sefer says that for whatever reason, we don't really know why, it says the Jews cried to God to be redeemed. But he says, remarkably, that they cried for one another. In other words, each Jew didn't cry for himself to be redeemed. He cried that God should redeem his fellow Jew. Each one cried for the other Jew. Wow. That means they had tremendous Ahavas Yisrael, love of the Jews, each one. And as a result of that, God said, if you are crying for each other, not for yourself, but every Jew is crying that his fellow Jew should be redeemed, then you are a family, right? And if you are a family, I have now become primarily not your king, right, but your father. And therefore, I will stop any prosecutions that try to stop your redemption. You see, because that's what a father does. Father will always listen to his child. And since you are now a family, right, then I am your father. If I'm your father, then I have the love I had for you is as a father. That's how I will act. That's what you do. Therefore, I will act that way. And as a result of that, I will stop the prosecutions that say you should not be redeemed because I am now your father. And I don't need the same justice or the same obedience. Therefore, I will forgive you for your sins and I will redeem you. You see the logic. And the Chassam Sofer says, this is actually what happened. What happened was saved the Jews and earned the redemption was what's called Ahavas Yisrael, love of one Jew to the other. That's what did it. You see, now isn't that incredible? What we learn here is something very profound. That if one Jew loves another Jew, in whatever degree, but the essential idea is that you have to love the Jew. If you can't, you can't. Or if you don't, you don't. But at least you won't badmouth the Jew. You won't denigrate, degrade, speak derogatorily. At least you don't do that. That means you love each other as a family member. Then we actually change the relationship that God has with us. He now becomes primarily a father and secondarily a king. So, if Klal Yisrael really wants to bring the redemption, we must increase our Ahavas Yisrael, our love of one another, and then God will become to us primarily. And the consequences is the greatest redemption of all time. You see, this is a very important secret, that not speaking Lashon Hara, why it can bring the Geulah, the redemption itself, and what the logic is, why speaking Lashon Hara actually prevents the redemption itself. And that's why Ahavas Yisrael is so important. And that is also the reason, by the way, while hatred of Israel, which is what we do when we speak Lashon Hara about Jews, why it prevents the redemption itself. In fact, that is why Sinas Chinam, which the Gemara says, destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, because all of a sudden the Jewish people became a nation and not a family. And therefore God, who now switched his role from a father to a king, now looked at the sins of the Jews and decided that these sins destroy the Achdus of Klal Yisrael from a family to a nation. And therefore God became a king more than a father. And as a result of that, he was not able to redeem the Jews or to save the Beis Hamikdash from being destroyed. So let's wake up and not badmouth Jews. Do not speak Lashon Hara, and we will be saved, and we will bring the Geulah and the Beis Hamikdash. Thank you.